Hi everyone, I'm Keith Mathis with the Mathis Group. On this short video, we're going to be talking about 9 deadly project management mistakes in government projects. Now, as we look at this particular video, let me kind of make sure you understand where I'm coming from. I'm talking about these areas to highlight areas to watch out for. Some of the best project managers I have ever worked with, ever been around, are government project managers. So this is not a video to just slam government. I think that's ridiculous anyway. But I did want to talk about 9 deadly project management mistakes in government projects to highlight these so that project managers can look for these and track these and be on the lookout to make sure that this is not something that happens to them. Mistake number 1, planning before a customer interview is completed. Now, as we get ready to interview the customer, one of the things that's interesting to this is many times you'll find people already creating a project plan, but they haven't interviewed the customer. That plan's based on the business case and the project charter, which is not normally enough information. So it's very important for us to understand that customer interview is going to give you a side of the project that nobody else has seen. Now, here's a couple of ideas for this. Planning before the customer interview. Reasons why planning takes place prior to a detailed interview of the customer. The first one is substitution of activities for planning. Many times in a government setting, people will assign a project and then they'll start asking how the project's doing in a couple of days. If you really look at project management processes, nothing really would be happening in a couple of days toward execution because you would be interviewing the customer and then you would be creating the plan from that interview and then you would be executing from that plan. But a lot of times, once again, you see a lot of activity, but nobody's doing any real planning. And what happens behind the scenes is this comes back and bites us because we implement a solution that's not good for us or something like this. There can be a lack of understanding that the project's goals and of the project goals and objectives, and failure to see the benefits of gathering information first. A lot of this has happened because the teams feel so much pressure to get moving, and that's why they start having activity before they ever really complete a project plan or interview the customer. So we need to watch out for this. This is a huge deal. We need to create a list of customized questions to gather the requirements. Now, when we're looking at interviewing the customer, we're not talking about just a surface level type of interview. We're talking about being able to dig down deep. Each question should be logical, built on the other, and you should use open questions to gather information about the basic foundation of the project and use closed questions to gather specific detail. If you do not participate in a customer interview of some type, you're going to find that you're not getting the full scope of the project. Now, what happens, how it fleshes out in a government project is we interview the customer, we didn't get all of the scope, but we think we did. We get 6 months into the project and all of a sudden the customer says something about a requirement and you realize that's not a requirement that you have documented. Nobody on the team has ever talked about it. And we look at that and say, well, the customer changed their mind. And they do change their mind sometimes. But is this a situation where the customer changed their mind, or is this a situation where we didn't do a good interview and now we're having to back up to add that piece of work to a project plan and make changes and then re-baseline because we didn't do a good interview. Setting up the customer interview as early as possible, then create a draft plan based on that information that has been gathered during the interview, and make a list of information you need in order to create a finalized plan. When you're interviewing the customer, you're asking specific questions. Don't treat them like an order taker. Treat them as someone like you're an internal consultant and you're interviewing them to find out exactly what they want and ask the hard questions. This is the place to ask the question because at the end of this, you need to eat, breathe, and understand what the customer wants. Okay, mistake number 2, top-down planning with little input from those working on the project. Now, I know if you are in upper management, you're already sneering at me over this, so please don't. But in many situations, we will have people who are top-down doing the planning and then handing it off to worker bees. Sometimes this works perfectly. But what you're finding right now is that when that happens, there's not a lot of buy-in from the worker who's going to be running the project. Also, what you find out is that sometimes these people who are closest to the implementation part of the project have great ideas on how to implement something. It could be faster, it could be cheaper, it could be better. And so this is something that we really need to watch out for with top-down planning. Even if you feel the necessity to do top-down planning, you could still meet with the team and hand it to them as a draft and say, look, I've created the plan, I've created the details for these documents as a draft. What other areas do you think that we need to add in here, or what areas did I miss? And if you give them permission to where they can shape it, it's going to be that much better. Now, with top-down planning, it's really looked at as old style. It makes the assumption that upper management has the best practices and ideas to run the project effectively, and employees have little input. Now, in a true functional organization, you're going to see this. This is pretty common. But as more and more of the millennials end up getting into the workplace, they hate this. They want to give their ideas. They want to work. Now, their experience is less, but they're wanting to learn these particular processes and methodologies as much as possible. But the younger the worker, they really want to give input. That's a high motivation for them. Also, with top-down, it limits buy-in from the team. A culture is created that signifies a lack of trust sometimes. In other words, the management didn't trust us to be able to plan it. Employees are not comfortable making decisions then, and employees do not generate ideas or solve problems. And so if we have top-down planning in our organization, what you're going to find out is that when something goes wrong, the project management team is not going to do anything associated with making that decision most of the time. They're going to bring it right back to management and have management make that decision because we've already set that culture up in this situation. Mistake number 3, the timeline is not realistic. I'm sure you've never heard this before. But listen, the mistake of timeline not being realistic happens for a lot of different reasons. The timeline is an estimate without the benefits of actual calculations. It's common in the early stages of development. It becomes a problem when this estimate gets locked into the timeline. Okay, a couple of things about the timeline. Because in government projects, most of them are driven by the budget. Other projects in other companies are not driven by the budget, they're driven by the scope. They understand the scope, then they create a WBS, which gives them estimates, and those estimates are in dollars and also in time. In government, though, you're different. Everything's driven by budget. So you have to come up with a basic timeline and a basic calculation of cost to be able to recommend to management so that it can be appropriated and so that you can have money to deal with, okay? So by doing that, you're making an estimate maybe 18 months before you actually get the money, and you might be making an estimate of the timeline 18 months out. So by the time this thing gets approved, these calculations are 18 months old. The other thing that we see about this too is that sometimes people are using numbers. It's 300,000 and it's 67 days of work, but it's talking points. It's not really calculated. It has never been calculated. So that's one of the most important things to understand. That 300,000 in those 67 days, who calculated that and when was it calculated? Did we calculate it understanding that we're running all these other projects? Or did we calculate it from the aspect of talking point, then it later became locked in as $300,000 budget and 67 days in length? Also in the timeline, it's perceived as an actual plan rather than a draft. Initial draft is based on a business case or a customer interview. The timeline is developed as deliverables are detailed. The timeline is detailed with a work breakdown structure. Now, if you're in an organization that doesn't do the work breakdown structure, the work breakdown structure almost looks like an org chart because what it does, it breaks it down and you're going to have categories of work. And then underneath each of those categories, you will then turn around and you will break down the work and you will come back later and put a cost and a time amount for each of those areas. Mistake number 4, the risk analysis is limited in depth. Many organizations do not do a risk analysis, and their statement is, well, we're going to do the project anyway. That is not the goal of the risk analysis. The risk analysis is you're looking for what could go wrong, meaning a threat, and what could go good or positive, which is an opportunity. So there's 3 main types of projects that we get looked into that have limited risk analysis: external projects, organizational projects, and technical projects. And what will happen is people look at this, at analyzing risk, as a waste of time. And yet that waste of time will save you so much time and money because you have anticipated what those risks are. And in many cases, you've adjusted your plan to counteract some of those risks. Now, this is what a risk breakdown structure would look like. You'll notice you have external, organizational, technical areas. These are pretty common in most. As you break it down, this would be a WBS. This looks like a WBS, but this is called a risk breakdown structure. And the reason is because this is only on the topic of risk. So you have external risk, you have organizational risk, and you have technical risk. And then what you would do is each of these would then, you would come up with a mitigation or a contingency plan for any of these that you felt like were high enough to hurt the project. You also have a project risk process. Brainstorm, ask the experts, pull from historical data. It allows you to set some risk indicators, evaluate the risk impact, create and prioritize the risk, come up with mitigation plans. If the plan's accepted, now you begin monitoring the indicators for that. And then you have a mitigation plan, you have a change management process, and you document the lessons learned. But also for monitoring indicators, if the risk occurs, you have a contingency plan. So you're looking on both sides. You're looking on contingency if the risk actually comes about. That's the plan you're going to use. Mitigation, you're trying to keep the risk from happening or reduce its impact. So you've got to look on both sides. Limited risk analysis. Risk has not been rated or prioritized. One of the things to look at is creating a series of ratings for each risk. Risk identification is a combination of the probability of a risk taking place and its impact. And so if we're not doing a risk analysis, then we're not getting to a quantitative side of this, of looking at probability times impact. And that gives you a numerical number to be able to decide this is the highest risk that we need to have a contingency plan for. This risk down here is pretty low, and we've got qualified people who can deal with this here in the organization. Now, this would look like a risk map. So you've got probability on one side, impact on the other, and then you've got a risk here on in that high impact, high probability quadrant. Now, as you look at this, this is going to be a section that you'd probably have a contingency for because it is so high. It's high impact, high probability. Mistake number 5, no communication plan. Now, many people, when the project fails, if they're surveyed, it's amazing how many surveys come back to lack or bad communication. All right, so if we don't have a communication plan, first off, let's understand what it is. It's a document which spells out the process and timing for communication in a project to all interested parties. So that means all of us are going to be listed. Every stakeholder associated with that project is going to be on the communication plan. Why? Because it's going to send our documents out to us of what we need to be able to know what's happening on that project. Meetings with the project sponsor, the customer, the project team. Is it weekly, monthly, daily? Current status on the project, daily project progress. Also use a standardized status and update checklist form. So there's a lot of different things that can be part of the communication plan. For an example, you could use checklists. For an example, a project status checklist, current status on the project, an update on the critical path. You discuss any bottlenecks or work stoppage, any concern areas, and transfer of information to important parties. This checklist could be something that you're looking at every status meeting. These are the bare bones minimum that we should be talking about in that status meeting. And then communication matrix or communication grid. You'll notice over on the left, you have a stakeholder, the documents that stakeholder needs, the frequency, the media would be the software. Is it coming in Word, Excel, or Microsoft Project? And who's responsible for getting that data to that stakeholder? And so I want you to see this. Of course, communication matrix can have a lot more than this, but the point is I want you to see this. Many people, when they talk about communication plan, they think it's basically a glorified email list. All right, mistake number 6, lack of project audits. So one of the reasons why projects will go down the tubes is there's not a lot of oversight. You say, well, wait a second, we're doing this as an internal project. Internal projects still need to be audited or oversight, just like you would with a vendor. So project audits are important for tracking and monitoring progress in a methodical way. It drives the project forward. It maintains quality. So when you do a project audit, one of the things that happens is you're looking to see, are we complying with what the contract says? Is the vendor complying with what the contract says? But let's say you're doing internal. Are we complying to the project plan and to the scope of work that has been defined with the customer? Auditing will examine overall efficiency, quality, and value of outcomes resulting from use of or non-use of a process, the practice, the policy, or the capability. Auditing activities will identify the efficiencies, qualities, and values associated with the project and project management, and auditing will also examine business and technical aspects of the project. So if we're doing an audit, we're being able to see ahead of time. First off, there's compliance, and that's what If you have a good vendor, that's what they're doing. But it allows you to be able to see potential mistakes or potential problems, and you're seeing it early. That's the reason why you want to do this. You're not wanting to wait until something actually happens. Areas to audit, and you can audit a lot of different things, but here are some things that people will audit: budget, the time, the phases, level of service, quality, communication, cycle time, processes, pilot programs. These are just some of the things that are mentioned, but you can audit a lot of different things. Mistake number 7, lack of proper monitoring of the critical path. Now, most people know that the critical path is the longest path through the project. What you might not know and remember is that the critical path has 0 float. Because it's the longest path through the project, it has no float. All the other paths through the project will have float in most cases at some point. So when we are looking at monitoring and people talk about schedules, the question that always comes to my mind is, how does the schedule compare to the critical path dates? Critical path dates, if I miss them, my project's late. I can miss a schedule date, but if it's on one of the non-critical paths, I'm not late at all. So it's essential to track and monitor critical path dates throughout the project life cycle. You're discovering the critical path can be determined by looking at activities which are independent of each other, and the critical path activities will use many resources in time and budget. But the thing you want to remember, it's the longest path through the project. Deadlines have different priorities, and not every activity date is critical. Activities with hard dates, such as the critical path, are given the highest priority. So if I was trying to speed my project up, or I was throwing more money at it for crashing, one of the things I'm looking at is my critical path dates. To throw money to crash my project and do non-critical activities doesn't make a lot of sense to me, unless it feeds into a critical path date. But if it's on the critical path, that's why I'm wanting to put my money and my resources, because that's really going to speed my project up. I can throw a lot of money at a non-critical path activity, and my project never gains any momentum whatsoever. Mistake number 8, overcommitting team members with too many projects. I'm sure you've never heard of this before. Let me describe what I see happening in a government setting. This isn't a criticism, it's an observation. We see a project manager running projects, and we will see in the pipeline tons of projects. In a government setting, so many times, this project manager is having to meet with all of these people on all of these projects down the road. And in some cases, what's happening is the project manager is not able to run the most important project because they're attending a meeting on number 37 that got into the pipeline. So what we need to understand is putting more projects in the pipeline, especially in a government setting, could actually slow all the projects down because the project manager is feeling the necessity to have to meet with all of these. So when we talk about overcommitment, one of those would be scheduling becomes unbalanced, high visibility of projects, strong performance of certain workers. This is what happens a lot of times where we get people overcommitted. We're saying, well, I've got them 40 hours and they're going to work 40 hours on the project. We know that's not realistic because they've got other jobs to do and they're going to be called into crisis and things like this. So we've got to be very careful or we're going to burn those individuals out. Also, proper balance in scheduling workers. Allowing project managers and team members to be scheduled at 70% of their time on a project, and that might be huge for some of your project managers, okay? So you're leaving 30% of their time to handle unscheduled emergencies, administrative issues that happen daily. All of these are pieces that make a huge difference. What it says basically is I cannot schedule you for 40 hours. I'm setting you up for failure, and I'm setting the project up for failure. Analyze the number of drop-ins or emergencies experienced by your project team. What's the cause? How are they handled? Now, you come to work on a project that's high priority, but if somebody else is having a crisis, it's not uncommon, and maybe this is different for you, but it's not uncommon for us to pull people off of other projects to help with this crisis. As you look at the crisis, you might realize this crisis is not as important as what I'm already doing with my project that I should have been working on this morning. Bottom-up estimating. It's a method of estimating project duration or cost by aggregating the estimates of the lower-level components of the WBS. When an activity cannot be estimated with a reasonable degree of confidence, the work within that activity is decomposed into more detail. It takes longer to do, but it's most accurate. One of the reasons why we overcommit people is because we give estimates that have not been calculated to the project or to the budget. And we put people in there thinking that they're going to do something in 15 months that takes 22 months. And so if we had participated or allowed bottom-up estimating to take place, and that's going to be your team members participating in estimating this, we would have seen that we think it's 15 months, but it's really going to be 22 months just because of the sheer nature of I only have so many people who can work on these projects. And so you start seeing that, you know what, all these empty positions that I have that I can't hire anybody for, it's killing my projects right now. And the reason it is because the projects are still coming down the pipeline, but you don't have adequate people to handle those. Mistake number 9, hesitating to confront the status quo for running projects. It's the idea we've always done it that way. So confronting the status quo, people become accustomed to a culture and do not want to change. And you hear things like this, we've never done it that way before, management won't let us, or we tried that 15 years ago but it didn't work. As a project manager today, we're having to confront status quo, and here's why. 30 years ago, some of the most stable organizations was going to be government, education, healthcare. They had the least amount of change, and you could work there for those 30 years, and you knew what was going to happen. They were stable, they didn't change a lot. Today, do you know what are the 3 main ones that are changing like crazy? Government, healthcare, and education. So the reason behind this, that we have to look at this, is that if we're in a government, we are changing like crazy. Government's having to be more competitive and having to look at things different than they ever have before. So we have to confront the status quo. People do not want to leave their comfort zone, and that's true for all of us. It could be because of fear, peer pressure, higher accountability, but we know what we know and we feel comfortable. We have a comfort zone around us, okay? And so we can move a little bit and still be in that comfort zone, but the thing is that we feel challenged a lot of times in trying to step outside of that comfort zone. What's needed, though, is sometimes, even in government, is a paradigm shift. Paradigm is a definition of reality, an idea or concept of how things work. Thomas Kuhn, in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, said a change in the basic assumptions or paradigms within the ruling theory of science is called a paradigm shift. So what we're doing is we're having to change how we think. We're having to change how we act. We're having to change that reality. It's an idea of concept of how things work, but we're having to change that. But we're going to have to fight that comfort zone that people experience. A paradigm shift is the radical change in thinking from an accepted point of view to a new one. A paradigm shift could be fundamental change in approach to incorporate a condition previously thought of as impossible or unacceptable. Organizational culture represents the way things are done in an organization. So in shifting the paradigm, you're looking at the values, the beliefs, the attitudes. And so let's say you have a negative group that you're working with at the organization. In order to shift the paradigm, it's going to be difficult because that negative attitude has already been anchored in the culture. And so you're having to try to shift that to be able to change it into a more wholesome or positive attitude. Now, the cultural web that we run into shows you all the influences on that paradigm. You've got symbols, power structures, organizational structure, control systems, rituals, routines, stories, myths. All these type of things influence that paradigm. So you're not just changing one thing, you're having to work in all of these areas in order to be able to influence that paradigm. Cultural change involves facilitating organizational cultural change. You have to acknowledge the existence and influence of the organizational culture. You have to have a clear and persistent vision of what the culture should be and what changes need to be applied, and then you have to manage change. Now, we've come to the end where we talked about 9 deadly mistakes that government projects make. Now, one of the things I want to say to you again is there are wonderful, wonderful team members and project managers in government. It's a miracle they get some of the projects done that they get done because of all the blockades that's around them in being able to handle and being able to drive a project that many times they have no authority, they have no more money, somebody else owns their resources, and they find themselves having to negotiate with those internal resources to get them to work on the project. I love government employees. I love government project teams and project managers. They are marvelous. And in many times they have a lot more skills than a private industry because they've learned how to do a lot with nothing. Now, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this is beneficial for your project team. If you have any questions, please give me a call. But thank you so much. God bless you. Have a great day. Bye now.